In 2019, NATO celebrated its 70th anniversary. Since 1949, NATO has become the most powerful defense alliance in the history of humanity. It successfully deterred the Soviet Union from expanding further into Western Europe. It maintained the peace in Europe. It won the Cold War. It incorporated the new democracies of Eastern Europe.
I think of NATO as a success story, because actually when you think about it, 70 years is a long time. And when I was at NATO headquarters, we were 16 nations. And to grow to on the cusp of having 30 members, I think that's a pretty good achievement in 70 years.
If you're in London this week, there are amazing posters in the Underground that in fact I just noticed this morning. And it says 1 billion people, 29 countries, 70 years. And then all the flags of the NATO members underneath that. And that's a very simple, very clear message that NATO is about safety and security and allowing members to live their way of life.
However, as leaders gathered to mark the occasion, it also became clear that this is one of the most challenging and significant moments in the organization's history. A make-or-break moment that will define NATO's role in 21st century Europe. Chapter 7. NATO in the 21st century. If there is one thing that everyone agrees on, that is the need for NATO to evolve in order to survive and remain relevant.
The things that NATO needs to concentrate on, and perhaps needs to have the discussion, whether that's via social media or summits such as NATO Engages, which is a group of think tanks getting together, or articles in the newspaper, are the threats that still face us and the change that's going to come in the next few years. And I think NATO is looking at cyber, it is looking at terrorism, it's looking at hybrid capabilities, hybrid warfare. It's looking at threats from aggressive groups rather than countries. And I think having things like science and technology summits and having classes in universities and schools just talking about basic security issues and probably less of the nuclear threat and the old-fashioned hard power. I think to get people interested, it's talking about things that have relevance to them. Why is it important to be focusing on space? Well, if you can't get a GPS signal, you know, everyone's forgotten how to read maps. You'll get lost. If you can't use your internet, if you can't use your mobile phone, you know, people get pretty stressed now if your power goes down for an hour or two because you can't charge your phone. Those sorts of things are now security.
One could see that NATO needs to refocus and possibly redefine itself because it's very different to its Cold War entity. You know, where in the Cold War it was relatively small, it was relatively homogenous. It is now much larger. There are many small countries like the Baltic republics who absolutely have a say but cannot contribute much to their own defence because they're very small. So NATO has evolved. I suspect that it probably needs to evolve its intellectual way of doing things and its physical way of doing things.
I think the one thing that you can see in 70 years is the way in which NATO has been able to adapt. And so you've seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, you've seen the expansion of NATO, you've seen the response after 9/11, the first time Article 5 was invoked. You've seen now the discussion of cyber threats and responses. And as I say, I think you'll see now how NATO will start to take into account the new domain of space. I think that's important, that the alliance is, some people might think it's slow, but actually it's got real dynamism the way that it has changed over the years.
At the core of NATO's mission and structure lies a fundamental tension that is often overlooked. NATO has a dual role, two faces. It serves two masters. On the one hand, it is an international and intergovernmental organization based on consensus, accountable to the heads of government, a norms-based forum in which 29, soon to be 30 member states have to gather, debate and agree on the best course of action.
I think it's very difficult with any large organisation that needs to carry all its members with it. It's very difficult to achieve a full consensus.
I think the power, the strength, if you like, comes from the relationships between the nations, because there are very few places where a number of countries are all together represented with their ambassadors and senior diplomats, all in the same building, seeing one another every day, the ability to pick up the phone, the ability to talk to one another in different NATO committees. So you've got that constant interchange and understanding, diplomatic understanding, and that was so important, and that remains important to this day, because it helps to understand, it helps to diffuse, it helps to calm tricky disagreements that might arise. It's another forum for bilateral discussion as well.
What we need to do is to go back to thinking that NATO is a place where you can hold serious political consultations. I think some of that's been lost in recent years. You know, there are many virtues to the fact that EU ministers meet each other every month and foreign ministers meet each other every month, and that the EU Political and Security Committee meets at least once a week. But one of the downsides is that that EU foreign ministers become very comfortable talking to each other, and they sometimes forget that, you know, for example, with Turkey, it's important to talk to Turkey as well as about Turkey. And NATO is a place where you can do that. It's a venue where you have that opportunity.
Crucially, however, NATO also has a second nature and mission, and that is to be a flexible and effective defense force that can protect the West. It is ultimately accountable to its citizens, who are also voters and taxpayers. NATO has to remain an agile body that can quickly respond to crises and provocations, and that can use force, or the threat of force, as needed, so as to maintain deterrence. Those two roles, the political forum in which member states promote their national interests, and the unified defense body that is agile enough to tackle threats, are fundamentally at odds. This tension reflects another divide between NATO's operations staff and internal work, and its outside image as it is constantly framed and reframed through political leaders' statements and media soundbites.
Well, I think there's the inside and the outside, frankly, and you often find this. What people are saying about the organisation from the outside isn't really reflected on what's going on the inside, where you've got a cadre of lifelong NATO public servants who really believe in what they are doing, who speak many languages, understand each other's culture, have formed a habit of working together, are highly skilled, technocratic, yes, but skilled and motivated. And they sort of keep the organisation humming along. And if you look at what the organisation is designed to do, you know, provide collective defence, mesh countries together in common decision-making, common consultations, common defence planning, divide burdens equally, react quickly to changing circumstances. And NATO's performing. You know, it's doing everything that people would expect it to do and what its mandate is. And people on the outside often have the impression that NATO's job is to save the world, or to save multilateralism, or to save global liberal democracy, or to provide magical European leadership where it doesn't exist. And that's asking the organisation to do things that it's not designed or intended to do. So I think that one of the problems today certainly is managing this kind of perception gap between the inside, where the organisation is performing well and effectively, and the debate in the outside world, where NATO is is often a football being asked to do things that it was not designed to do, and how we close that perception gap is, I think, one of the key challenges that the Alliance is going to face over the next few years.
As the world becomes more globalized, digitized and pluralistic, public engagement becomes ever more important. This wasn't always the case. For much of the 20th century, the power of national governments to set policy and the certainties of mutually assured destruction and nuclear deterrence meant that NATO could almost afford to take the public for granted. Not anymore. Ultimately, as with any other political institution, NATO's long-term survival will depend on whether it's seen not just as relevant, but as existentially vital by the public, and in particular by younger generations.
It's a tricky one. We, as a younger audience, are technically easily bored, our attention span's notoriously short, and we like to consume a lot of video digitally. These are perhaps norms that NATO weren't used to in terms of spreading their message traditionally, but I would like to see perhaps a greater online presence from NATO and spread their message along the younger generation so they can carry that and pass that along as they continue to grow old.
We want the people who want to understand to come to us, and what we're doing is trying to engage them on their platform. So, for example, we've set up a Facebook group where we have thousands of young people who are talking not just to us but each other every day. It's one of the places we have the highest levels of engagement with young people. And the great thing is that it's something that we can set up, but then after that a lot of the engagement is organic. People then start talking increasingly to each other, and so you create a community, and I think that's the main thing in terms of engaging with younger people. What we have understood, it's taken a while, but what we've understood is we have to talk their language on their platforms in their manner, and that is what we're trying to do. NATO's 70 years old, and 70-year-olds are not always the best at talking to the younger generation, but we're making that effort. We understand that it's necessary, and as I say, we're developing new tools to do so.
As social media, news feeds, algorithms and private data become weaponized, media literacy, the ability to critically evaluate media content, is becoming an integral part of any resilience and deterrence strategy.
I think the safest thing we can do is just have multiple perspectives and have an open mind and be logical when reading something and doing our own research and looking at different sources, and then going on your judgment whether you think the overall picture is. I think that's the safe way to consume media.
I think the way Russia is reshaping the world is the biggest theme actually of now, also the biggest threat of now, and the more people who can contribute to it, whether it's through academic papers or through investigative journalism or through sending people like me anonymous tips, the better, because dark times, and we need light in dark times.
In the months and years ahead, Europe's leaders and publics, including the new European Commission, will have to decide how to address the security challenges emerging from Russia and China, what NATO's role is in 21st century Europe, and how NATO and the European Union can best work together.
The question for me is, can the Alliance and the EU build on the good relationship that Stoltenberg and Mogherini had, which enabled them to overcome some of these problems in a practical way, even if they couldn't overcome them in a political way? Can Borrell build on that? And can somebody persuade President Macron that the answer to the problems that he has rightly identified is not less NATO, but actually more NATO?
Much of the discussion on NATO's future has focused on Europe. Yet NATO's unique strength has always been its transatlantic reach and the sense of a global defense community that it managed to create in the 20th century. NATO's role was clear while hundreds of thousands of American troops and their families were stationed in Europe after World War II. As the United States turned its focus away from Europe after the end of the Cold War, younger generations of Americans have not had the chance to learn and understand what NATO stands for and why it's still needed.
I mean, one of the amazing things about NATO is it is a transatlantic alliance. It's got a 6,000-mile geographic spread. And if you're in Arizona, for example, in the southwest of the United States, it might be quite hard to make the case for why are we being involved here in Arizona with a conflict that's happening, as was so famously said in the run-up to the Second World War, in a country far away of which we know nothing.
Therefore, maintaining NATO's unity and power of deterrence is a matter of collective identity and cultural affinity, rather than purely geographic proximity. This means that for NATO to survive and continue to protect the West in the 21st century, it is vital for the people in Western countries to have an understanding of the values and principles that are core to their shared identity. If NATO is facing a crisis of unity and identity, that is because the West is facing a crisis of unity and identity. The extent to which younger generations subscribe to this effort will largely determine whether it succeeds or not. The stakes couldn't be higher.
Security is essential for your entire way of life. You take it for granted. It's the ultimate insurance policy that you pay your premium and you really hope you never have to use. It allows you to go about your daily life and do what you want to do in a style that you want to do it, and the freedom to live your life. And you can't do that if you don't have security.
The price of security is eternal vigilance. At the end of the day, you get the security you deserve, and you get the security that you invest in, and you get the insecurity where you haven't made that investment. So, it's not something that falls like manna from heaven. It's something that has to be created and recreated every single minute of the day, every day of the week, every week of the year.
I would say that for me, the thing that's the scariest, the thing that I find the most immediate, is the threat of our democracy dying because of foreign actors.
Should we be worried about democracy in the UK? I think we should be super worried about democracy in the UK, I really do.
Freedom and democracy are hard won and easily lost, and particularly when we start to take them for granted. And that would be my message to young people. We must never take them for granted.
I think young people care a lot more than they show about these issues.
Jamie Shea's advice to the heads of NATO's member states is to stay united.
Stay united, because the unity of NATO is worth 100 nuclear weapons and 10,000 NATO tanks.
If there is one thing we learn from history, that is that the future is unpredictable. The trajectory of world politics is full of chain reactions and unintended consequences.
I remember in 1990, 1991, Francis Fukuyama so memorably wrote about the end of history. And within a week or two of the end of history being published, we were starting a whole new history. And that history was taking many forms. It was taking the UK and its allies into battle in a part of the world where they hadn't been for 70 or 80 years. And on the morning of 9/11, very few people in 2001 could have imagined what was going to happen that afternoon and how the impact that would have. And we are still very much involved. 9/11 will have spawned indirectly ISIS. ISIS is what many people perceive to be the #1 threat to us now. You've got to be very careful to say, well, the Cold War's over, everything's fine.
We're in a very strange moment, and I think the answer is to stay cheerful and to realise that NATO, in a confused world of hybrid war, in our cacophonous 21st century, is more important than ever.
The coronavirus outbreak has made clear that many of the challenges we face are too great for any one nation or organization to face alone. This is an unprecedented crisis, but we have overcome crises before, and together we will overcome the coronavirus crisis.